This is a recording with Mr. Don Pettit. The date is November 10th, 1993. We're in Ottawa. Good morning, Mr. Pettit.
Good morning.
Thank you very much for taking time to talk with me today. I'd like to ask you some questions about your life as a landscape architect and your connection with the Canadian Society of Landscape Architecture. And thank you very much for sending me your resume and that information. It says that you were born here in Ontario, in Grimsby. And maybe could we just talk for a few minutes about your schooling, where you went to school and kind of how you got interested in becoming a landscape architect?
I did my early education, elementary and high school in Grimsby, in the Niagara area. And I think I was very fortunate to have grown up in Grimsby because it is in what is known botanically as the Carolinian zone, and I quite early on became familiar with things like sassafras and redbud and California, or rather Florida dogwood, which all were native there, among other things. Grimsby didn't have an organized playground or park, and I think that turned out to be fortunate because when we were kids, our playground was at Niagara Escarpment. And, during my high school years, I took some painting and drawing lessons in Hamilton, Ontario, and I went every Saturday morning for a few years. And that was in lieu of having to take music lessons.
The lesser of two evils.
And I enjoyed that very much. And the lady that I took lessons from, I think, was a person who taught me to look, but also to see. And that's certainly been a great faculty to have, I think, and one that needs development over the years in one's career. From Grimsby, or one of the people who had, I think, considerable influence on my direction in life was Mr. Andrew Fulton. And he was a Guelph graduate who during his career was a partner in a fruit importing firm in London, England. And they came back to Canada in the early 40s. And he introduced me to OAC and mentioned that a classmate of his was a landscape architect. And I think that was the first time I ever heard of such a beast. And and that was Gordon Cullum. And Gordon Cullum was a student at Guelph, and then broke his studies and went overseas with the Guelph Artillery Battery and came back and graduated in 1922, and then went to Harvard. He practiced in the United States for quite a number of years, and I believe during the 30s returned to Canada from the Olmsted office, having an arrangement that he would bring some of their contracts back to Ontario to execute here, and then continue his practice. And his practice was, to a large extent, residential planning. Well, in 1945, I went to Guelph with a very fine group of people, most of whom had 4 to 6 years of war and were anxious to get on with their lives. And I think as a group of people, they influenced me tremendously. And then at the end of my second year at Guelph, I thought I'd like to work somewhere other than home for the summer. And Professor John Wheel said that they had received a letter in the Department of Horticulture asking about someone who might eventually fill a faculty position at McDonald College. And somehow or other, John Wheel, wrangled a job for me at St. Anne de Bellevue at McDonald College, which was part of McGill. And I spent 2 lovely, wonderful summers there. The second summer, I met a girl who became my wife. And then at the end of the second summer, going into my 4th year, the chairman of the Department of Horticulture at McDonald asked me if I would like to come back as a lecturer on permanent staff, and I graduated. And I said, well, if I graduate, I thought that was a very nice offer. And I did that. I went to McDonald.
So that was about 1949?
In 49, yes. And it wasn't until I got to McDonald College that I met my first living landscape architect. And one evening there was an OAC alumni meeting at the faculty club out at McDonald, which was at St. Anne de Bellevue. And we were asked to go around, as they went around the room, to stand and give our name and our present employment and our year of graduation. And a man got up and said his name was Morris Howitt, and he was a landscape architect, and he had graduated in '09, and I was dumbfounded that anyone could be graduated that far back. And here I sit in the same boat today.
Where had he gone to school?
The Howitt family it was a Guelph family. He had graduated from OAC, and I don't know whether he had been overseas during World War I or anything of that, or when he actually went to Harvard and graduated, but he worked then in the Olmsted office, as many did. And Howitt might have been the first Canadian to do graduate studies in landscape architecture at Harvard. And that could well be.
Yeah.
And Morris Howitt, then I was doing some consulting work for the city of Montreal, and he invited me in, and I went in, and he was showing me a job that he was doing for the city, which was a development plan for the surface of a large water reservoir on Mount Royal. And I was quite impressed. He had evidently done this kind of thing before. He discussed the loadings on the concrete, trees and other things that he was doing, and how it demanded some very careful study. And I found him to be a very fine, quiet-spoken gentleman. And then I saw him a few times after that, later on at CSLA meetings, and I don't know when he passed away. Then at McDonald, I'll just have to check some notes here.
Sure. Harvard Graduate School of Design was in here at some point?
It was in the years I was at McDonald, and McGill granted me leave of absence to go to Harvard for graduate studies on full salary, which at that time was $2,400 a year.
Somehow we managed, though, didn't we?
And while I was at McDonald, I tried to get a course developed, and this was within the Department of Horticulture, which made it somewhat difficult, but to improve the course in landscape design and encourage anyone who was there who seemed to have the abilities to go on for graduate studies. And at that time, it meant going out of the country to places like Harvard, Cornell, Pennsylvania, and so on. Three of the students who took classes from me, Don Graham, D.W. Graham, Eric Harkness, and Douglas Harper, all went on. Don Graham and Eric Harkness went to Harvard, and Doug Harper, I believe, went to Michigan State.
Was that one of the reasons that McDonald College had granted you the leave so that you could learn the design aspect, because your undergraduate work was was more related to horticulture, was it?
Yes.
And you hadn't. Were there any design courses as part of that, or was Harvard where you learned the design?
I should back up a bit and talk about Guelph, because one of the things you'd asked in our correspondence was who had influenced me. Mm-hmm. And I think, other than my parents and my wife and Mr. Fulton, whom I mentioned, Louise Heringa at Guelph, a Dutch lady who had a great deal of design talent, and made us familiar with the history of landscape architecture, and using a text, as we recall, by Anne-Marie Gottheim, called The History of Garden Art. And she gave quite a good course, I thought, and still do at that time. And she also encouraged students to go on for graduate work. And again, we had to leave the country if we wanted to do that. Now, while I was at Guelph and in my 2 summers at McDonald College, in the 3rd summer in 48, I had an opportunity to come to Ottawa, and I had never been in Ottawa before, to attend a conference of the Canadian Parks and Recreation Association, primarily to hear Jacques Grobert speak about the new plan for Canada's capital. And for a young student to be able to listen to a planner of Jacques Grobert's stature was, sort of an untold pleasure, or honor I felt to be able to go. And McGill paid the expenses, by the way. After 3 days in Ottawa, I got back and submitted an expense account for $55, I believe. And the room rate at the Chateau was $10 a night. However, Grobert had a person working with him, whom I got to know later quite well, Douglas L. MacDonald. And there was a group called the National Capital Planning Committee, and which was, I think, headed by Grobert, and Doug MacDonald was part of that. Well, then he later came with the Federal District Commission, the predecessor of the NCC, and became director of planning and property at one time. Doug MacDonald was a landscape architect, a native of Ottawa, who had gone to Cornell, was a member of CSLA for a number of years, and was involved extensively in the acquisition of the Greenbelt around the capital and the furtherance of the Grobert plan as time went on.
So both of one of the reasons that you're mentioning these people is that they have had a lot of influence on your what you're designing, your understanding of landscape architecture.
I think my understanding of landscape architecture, and certainly in 48, that was before I had graduated from Guelph, before I'd gone to Harvard, mm-hmm. And also in 48 when I came to Ottawa to hear Grobert, I met Edward I. Wood, and he was chief landscape architect for the Federal District Commission at that time, and then for the National Capital Commission in later years. I think I had a great respect for Edward I. Wood for what he had done with the resources he had available here to further the capital plan. And he was fortunate in that he had a very strong staff in the field of, doers, really, and had total control over them. He had a relatively small office staff, and no, I'm going to be jumping back and forth here because I'll come back to Edward I. Wood a bit later.
Sure.
In the summer of 1952, I had vacation from McDonald College, and I went to Don Mills, and Mac Hancock was in the throes of getting the party put together for the Don Mills plan, and he brought Hideo Sasaki from Harvard, who worked with him and I think had an influence on the basic scheme for the Don Mills plan. Then in 1954, I left McDonald College and went to Don Mills Developments Limited as senior planner. Mac was director of planning at that time. And that was about a 2-year period. And then after I left Don Mills Developments Limited, which was a wonderful experience for a young person, or anyone really. And in 56, a group of us who had all been at Don Mills formed Project Planning Associates Limited. And there were seven people, 7 equal partners who founded Project Planning Associates. And we had many long discussions before this really took place. We had to discuss the timing when it would be feasible for us to sort of leave Don Mills Developments and become part of this new firm that we were forming. We had to discuss the financial aspects of getting a firm together and who was going to do what within the firm, and also try to give some thought to what our early prospects for work might be. And so we got started. We leased a couple of rooms in something that wasn't much more than the glorified boarding house on St. Mary's Street, just south of Bloor in Toronto, between Bay and Yonge. And our drafting equipment consisted of an 4x8 sheet of plywood cut in half and four horses. We soon realized that we had to get into some better quarters because it was a little embarrassing to invite anybody to our office in sort of that environment. We then moved to 40 Irwin Avenue, and
I'm sorry, what was it?
40 Irwin Avenue, IR. And there we remained. At least the firm was there when I disposed of my interest in project planning in 1964. And the people that I mentioned who were the sort of founders of project planning was certainly Michael Hancock, Wallace Little, Ted Smith, Douglas Lee, Noboru or Nabi Koyama, Walter Meyer, and myself. And we each put in $1,000 and got the show on the road, as it were. And we put in very long hours, had a lot of hard work, and which I think turned out to be worthwhile. And some of us did a lot of traveling. And this, I think, was when I began to realize the size of Canada, the people who make up its population, and its landscape. And as the years went on, I became more and more, I suppose, enthralled with the Canadian landscape, and came to realize that certainly my ancestors made the right decision in coming to settle a country of this sort, and that it's an absolutely marvelous country. And I hope to God that we can do everything we can to protect the environment within this country. I think of perhaps the first time I saw the Rocky Mountains and the Selkirks and some of that area, Rogers Pass, and breathtaking and an unbelievable scale. Another memory is of a prairie night with the northern lights, coyotes, and the silence made one realize that we were pretty small elements on this earth. And then going to the East Coast, the surf pounding on the rocks at Louisbourg and Cape Breton, all of this and things in between made me realize that became certain that I had chosen the right profession, and we had so much to work with. And we also had so much to destroy if we were not careful. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it has been.
What were some of the projects that you did do in those early years? I mean, this is 1956 that you started this company. That was very early in the sort of the history of landscape architecture in Canada. What were some of the things that you took on?
Well, when we started out, a well-known planner in Toronto, and we heard of this later, told some people that he gave us a year and that'd be it, we'd be finished. And I think when we heard that, we became more determined.
That's right.
And one of the early jobs that I've noted here was in Atikokan, which was a town of, I think, about 6,000 people. Steep Rock Iron Mine was there, and we did a master plan of open space for Atikokan, which was quite an undertaking for a little town of that sort, and it was quite an undertaking to get there. We would fly on, at that time, Trans-Canada Airlines to then Fort William, and drive 145 miles on a gravel highway into Atikokan. And that is a marvelous part of the country as well. Then we were involved at a relatively early time in project planning with the St. Lawrence Park System. And at that time, I think it was called the Ontario St. Lawrence Development Commission. And they had, this was prior to the flood of the Lake Iroquois for the Seaway. And the moving of towns was involved, relocating of towns along the St. Lawrence by Ontario Hydro. The Ontario St. Lawrence Development Commission had some rather large holdings of land stretching from Lancaster near the Quebec border to Adolphustown on the Bay of Quinte. And we did work from master planning work for all the parks, not for the one that Adolphustown, Austin Floyd had done that earlier. That was a small area, but we did work all the way from Lancaster to St. Upper Canada Village and on up to Browns Bay on the St. Lawrence. And now I'll mention some people who were involved with that. Landscape architects in a minute. Other project, Grand Beach, Manitoba, which was a job for the province of Manitoba, 65 miles north of Winnipeg. The relocation and the obliteration of a lot of decrepit cottages. And the master planning for that area involved relocating the cottage development up Lake Winnipeg on the east side. That Grand Beach, I recall, had one of the finest white sand beaches in North America, freshwater, marvelous beach. And we did work for national parks at Banff National Park, at Lake Louise, Lower Lake Louise, in the Trans-Canada Highway area, the Visitor Center, Elk Island National Park, east of Edmonton, and the Toronto Islands project, which was a large project. And these are all Canadian projects, of course. The Toronto Islands project involved dredging, raising the elevation of the islands, and putting in the infrastructure and ferry docks and that thing. A great variety of design problems and challenges. Van Wagner's Beach at Hamilton. That I think might have been the first case where residential properties, both permanent year-round properties and summer cottages, were acquired by a level of government for use as public open space. So it often went the other way, but this went that way. And we did the then new City Hall in Hamilton, the site development for that. A great many other things. Work was going on at when I left project planning, the Kuwait job had started. And we had an office in, the main office was Toronto. We had a small office in Halifax and a staff there, and a minute office at that time in London, England. And
do you want to take a little? Do you want to break for a second? Or, I mean, I can
that would be, yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. You were just mentioning some of the projects that you'd worked on. Are there some other ones that you would like to discuss?
Well, if I could talk about the Banff Lake Louise project and the Elk Island project.
Okay.
I think one of the reasons that landscape architects were involved in these projects, and that our firm was involved, was that there was a landscape architect at national parks at that time, Otis Bishoprick. And Bish was one of the early members of the CSLA. And in my opinion, he was the father of landscape architecture within the staff organization of our national park system. And in some ways, that's a rather sad thing to have to report, that our national park system had been in existence since, 1885, and it took that many years to really get a landscape architect on staff. And I think it was he who sort of introduced us to the people at national parks, and being a multidisciplinary organization, art services were retained. And Bish, or Otis Bishoprick, I don't know a deal about his academic background, but Roman Fodchuk is doing a paper on him, and hopefully that will form part of the CSLA archives. Another project we were involved with, and also a national park project, was, I think it was about 1962, we did some early work on the redevelopment of Louisburg and Cape Breton. And Bob Calvert, who was with us, an architect and landscape architect, went to France and spent some time in the archives, the historical archives in Paris, and found the original plans for the, I've lost the name of the main building there. However, they had done excavation work in the area, and it was not the King's Bastion, but perhaps Company.
Yeah.
He did research work there to try to determine which of 3 plans that were in existence had been built. And this involved converting scales that we were familiar with to the French scale at the time, called the pouce, which was the inch, the thumb. And then the major drawing was done of the existing foundation at Louisburg. And then these 3 plans were drawn to scale and all superimposed over the major drawing. And one of them fit almost perfectly. And they said, okay, this was a plan that was built.
My goodness.
And so that it has a lot of interesting, our practice had a lot of very interesting facets.
And Bob Calvert was he with Parks Canada then?
No, Bob Calvert was at Project Planning Associates.
He was with you?
Yes. And so I think those are some of the things. Mac, and certainly a large amount of projects, many that took place after I left Project Planning Associates and went to Ottawa. But I'd like to mention some of the people the ones that I can remember, and I hope I haven't missed any or too many, landscape architects who passed through the portals of project planning while I was there. And I'll give you this list in writing later on, but Eric Harkness, Canadian from Iroquois; Brad Johnson, another Canadian from Kingston; Dick Toth, American, who later became Dean of the School at University of Utah; John Lancius; Don Russell, an Albertan, and I think it was a graduate of Alberta and Harvard; Dick Strong, another Harvard person; Michael Huff, who was from England via the United States, and Mike had a master's from the University of Pennsylvania; Alan Graham from England; Walter Kim; Don Jung from California. He and his wife couldn't hack our winters, and they headed back to the sunshine. Bob Calvert; Dick Forster; Marlene Das, a young lady from India, graduate of Michigan State; and Ken McFarland. Ken was an OAC graduate, and we persuaded him to go on to, I think, Michigan State. And then I think Ken's life was abruptly terminated not too many years after that, unfortunately. However, I think that's 14. And at the time, I suppose, these people, many of them went on to their own practice and developed that. Some went into the academic world. Eric Harkness, for instance, is a senior with the planning staff at Atlanta, Georgia, and on and on. So they, many of them came to Canada via the project planning thing, and then went on to do whatever they wished after that. And we had they were all interesting. We tried to, our objective was to get people who had excellent academic qualifications and who, if they'd had some practice, so much the better. But by and large, I think we found that they were a wonderful group of people, professionals, and then have gone on to individually make their mark as a professional. I think that sort of covers project planning, if we can then move on to, well, I'd like to talk about the schools of landscape architecture in Canada, and in particular Guelph. But and as far as my career, some of these schools sort of came into being between my days at project planning and my days in the federal public service. A number of people were anxious to see a school in Canada, and I was certainly among that group, because it was expensive and sometimes difficult to get away to do graduate work, and there was no undergraduate base in Canada as a school of landscape architecture. A number of people were involved, I think, as I say, to encourage in their own way the development of a school in Canada. And I don't think any one individual can be credited as being the prime mover. I think it might be a relatively small group who gradually evolved and sort of put a lot of pressure on the universities. I know we had a lot of meetings at Hart House, University of Toronto, and we found many of those very discouraging, that we couldn't get something moving there. We we had a number of meetings at Guelph with Dr. Robert Hilton, Bob Hilton, who was then chairman of the Department of Horticulture. And he agreed that he would take this. He supported the idea, and he took it to the Board of Governors and the Senate of the University at Guelph. And managed to get a position, and that position was filled by Victor Janasic. Now, people who were sort of involved, I mentioned that myself and Mac Hancock and had a number of meetings about this, and Norman Scott, Owen Scott's father. Owen was one of the early graduates of the school at Guelph. I think Norman Scott was on the Senate of the Board of Governors of the university at the time, which helped a great deal. And but as I say, that I don't think any one person can be credited with that. Well, then Vic Janasic, and I really believe that Vic Janasic needs some special mention in the annals of the CSLA. He had a very difficult job to get the course started, the landscape architecture, to get that course to become a school of landscape architecture out of the Department of Horticulture. He finagled or wangled or something a building of their own, which they still have. So the School of Landscape Architecture at Guelph, at the University of Guelph now, is identifiable within its own walls. Vic was chairman for 2 terms, I think it's 10 years, and he did a tremendous amount of work, not only to develop a curriculum, but to he would have think tanks too, and have a number of people, related disciplines, in to discuss curriculum. And of course, he had to live with the internal politics of the university, and all universities have that. And he spoke, he wrote, he did a lot to promote the profession. And being the first director of the school and having gone through all those difficulties, I think Victor needs a special mention somewhere. And then, as time went on, the University of Toronto had an LA program in the within the School of Architecture. University of Montreal, the University of Manitoba, and the University of British Columbia. And I can tell you from my heart that the establishment of these schools, just knowing that they took place during my career, I suppose, as a landscape architect, is a very wonderful feeling. To know that there are all these places in Canada where students can go for professional training, which we didn't have. We had to go abroad.
Do you think that, may I ask you a question just on that? How do you feel that a Canadian university, I know you mentioned that the cost of going to the United States and the perhaps the inconvenience of it, how do you feel that a Canadian school would make a difference, or do you feel that it would make a difference in the actual training of landscape architects?
Yes, I think so. I think because first of all, they're at home, in Canada. They're within the Canadian milieu. And I think if the schools are wise, so they'll certainly see that these students go on field trips or studies to other parts of Canada. And I think the instruction they're getting is good. And I think I have a feeling that all the schools are always striving for excellence in instruction and facilities and that sort of thing. And I certainly have no quarrel with someone doing, say, a bachelor's in Canada and going to another university in Canada for a graduate degree, or say to the United States. But I'm a dyed-in-the-wool Canadian. I'm sorry. I don't know if that bothers anybody. Tough bananas. And I think, the School of Harvard I was familiar with, I was always enthralled with the library facilities they had, not only throughout the university, but within the Department of Landscape Architecture in the Graduate School of Design. And thousands and thousands of references were available. And if it wasn't in the building where we were, if we asked the departmental librarian for it, it was brought in from a book repository and it was there in the afternoon for us. Well, that's a tremendous facility to have. Now, of course, I didn't train in the computer age. That's a whole new era and a wonderful one. And I didn't even train the metric system. However,
that was very recent.
So I have certainly respect for the Canadian schools, and I have very high hopes for them that we will see that they all continue to strive for excellence. Now, insofar as LA schools are concerned, there's another person I'd like to mention. That's Hugh Knowles, University of Alberta. In 1966, when I was with National Parks, I had a business trip out to Calgary and Banff. And I had been talking to Hugh before, and he asked me if I could come to Edmonton to and attend a meeting of deans, because he was working very hard to get a school developed at Guelph, or at the University of Alberta. And at that time, I believe it's what called now the University of Calgary, or University of Alberta, Calgary. That's it. And they were coming at the being, and they were also developing a school, I believe, of environmental design or planning. And so we had a very good session with the committee of deans, and he was very hopeful after that. Well, then Calgary got the jump on the Edmonton situation, and Hugh, I suppose, certainly lost out at that time. So Hugh Knowles is another person, another LA in Canada, another golf grad, by the way, who was one of the workers and supporters of a school in Canada, whether it happened there or not.
Mm-hmm. Do you think one of the reasons that I asked the question about the education in Canada is I wonder if there's a difference in the design training or the information of someone who's educated in the United States versus someone who's educated in Canada. Do you feel that your training at Harvard that there was some other kind of influence that given to you that you then projected onto the Canadian scene? How do you feel about that?
Well, I suppose, yes, that there were things that happened there at Harvard, and the people, the instructors or professors that we had, and they perhaps had a greater influence than we realize. For instance, in 1951, when I first went to Harvard, Walter Gropius, who was chairman of the Department of Architecture within the School of Design, welcomed all the new graduate students one evening in a little talk. And one of the things he said to all of us, he said, and this was landscape architects, and planners. One of the things he said was that in your careers, you will always find the human to be the dominant element. And I've thought of that many, many times, and it's a very difficult thesis to destroy. Whether you're dealing with a problem of an urban open space,
Okay. Sorry, you're saying the use by humans
of space, almost regardless of where it is. In many of our projects, we want to bring people in, and we want to bring them in to use these spaces in a certain way. In other areas, I find that the human becomes a dominant element in that they tend to be destructive, and we might want to keep the human out of an area or control their use of that particular area or thing very carefully. I recall being in an alpine meadow in Revelstoke National Park in the spring of the year when it was in full flower. And if one has not experienced that kind of thing, it's almost impossible to describe it. The vivid colors, the types of plants, the ecology of the area. And it's in a very, very fragile ecology. Prior to my going to National Park, someone had decided that it would be a good idea to build a tea room up in this alpine meadow. And a road had been constructed up the mountain to provide a parking lot. I sat there with Tom Fenton, who was the Western Regional Engineer, and a very visionary person, and a warden who had a little cabin up there. And we sat and had our sandwiches and a cup of tea out of a milk pond. And I stood out and almost sat there and almost breathless to see this panorama of color and scale of the landscape, and that we were going to bring humans in there and destroy, I don't know how much of this alpine meadow, which would never recover. It was so fragile. So yes, humans are certainly the dominant element, either in terms of bring them in to use an area or a facility, or keeping them out or controlling their use very carefully. And these are very difficult, oftentimes very frustrating problems. And oftentimes there is a political aspect. And that will never be fathomed, I don't think.
That's a good answer. Thank you. That's a good answer to that question.
Students, in almost in relation to this kind of thing, I mentioned that politics comes into play frequently, and one way or another. And I felt that students at the undergraduate level, maybe in their senior year, should at least have one lecture by a person who has lived within the political framework at whatever level, and one who has practiced work from without, but being done for people within the political framework. To me, this is quite important to the students be aware of this, because it might save them some very embarrassing moments when they get before what they would hope to be a client or a potential client. And sometimes I have said this, and I think people think, well, he's more concerned about that than about design. Quite the contrary. I think that design training is absolutely essential, and by competent people. And I also think that students should be made aware of the pitfalls that they might encounter in the business of practice. Now, if you're about to drop from hunger, I can quit.
I'll just go ahead.
I had mentioned national parks and Otis Bishopric. I'd like to mention that Otis Bishopric was able to develop a staff and bring in staff, people such as Roman Fodchuk, Ed Holbowitz, Peter Coe, and then some technicians, Walter Paszynski, and people of that sort. And this was an achievement for landscape architecture in National Park Service.
About when would that be, time-wise? Do you have any idea? Sort of in the 60s?
I would think late 50s, early 60s.
Okay.
Yeah.
We'll
check with Roman.
Yes.
Are you going to be speaking to Ed Holbowitz? No.
Yes.
We are.
I hope so.
Oh, well, then he's just written a 4-page thing for Roman on Otis Bishopric.
Oh, good. And then you were mentioning also the National Capital Commission?
Yes, I disposed of my interest in project planning in 1964 and came to Ottawa. Ned Wood had come to Toronto one time, and we had talked, and I had known him for a long time and had respect for the work he had done, and he as a person, and I was extremely interested in the fact that Canada's capital had a plan to guide one of the few planned cities in North America to that extent. Now, as time went on, the plan evolved and things changed, but at least it had a basis to start from. Ned Wood asked me in Toronto if I would be interested in going to Ottawa. And I said, I would certainly have to think about that for a while. My wife is from Ottawa, and I went home and said, would you be interested in moving to Ottawa? that certainly helped my decision, I think, in some ways. But the pace at project planning was getting pretty hectic, and we had two little girls then growing up, and so a lot of factors brought in, and I finally decided that I would go to Ottawa, the National Capital Commission. Well, I went as Ned Wood's assistant chief landscape architect for the NCC, National Capital Commission, and I was there a year, and there were management consultants doing a management study of the commission, and I wasn't too excited about all this stuff. And I had an offer to go to national parks. Well, I went to national parks then for a year, almost exactly a year, and saw national parks from a different perspective. And that year I could have written a book. Then at the end of the year, at National Parks, Ned Wood again appeared in my office in Ottawa and told me that the chairman, who was Lieutenant General Clark, and the general manager, Eric Thrift, an architect planner at the time, would like to meet with me and discuss if I would like to come back. And that did a lot for my ego, just knowing that somebody wanted your services. And so I went and had a discussion with them, and General Clark, who had been chief of general staff, was a very direct man. And when I sat down, he said, well, the first thing, Don, he said, we want you back. So we talked about that for a while, and Ned was not well, and he was going to retire, and sure, and I would go into this new position of director of design. And it would be a division. And so I said, well, it took me, in Toronto, it took me a long time to decide to come to Ottawa. But I said, I'll let you know by morning, mid-morning, my decision about this. And I left and went home. And the next morning I phoned Ned Wood back, and I said, well, I've decided to come back, but I realized after I got home that we hadn't discussed salary. So that was quickly straightened out and very acceptable. I went back. And then I, over time, had the resources that became available to me to put together a multi-discipline division, design division. And again, I think hard-working people like Gropius, Norman Newton, and so on had influenced me a lot, and certainly our experience of project planning on the multi-discipline approach to design. So I was quite determined that I would have architects, engineers, and landscape architects would be at the same level. The chief of those sections, 3 sections, would be at the same salary level. And I saw no reason that my landscape architect should be less than that. Well, then I developed a staff of landscape architects and technicians, support staff for them, engineers, architects, quantity surveyors, estimators, and so on, and then the support staff on that level. And over time, there were little challenges that came up because of the personnel rules. The government is riddled with rules. One of the early things we had to do was make sure that landscape architecture was looked upon as a profession in the public service. And Roman Fodjuk and Ed Halbowitz, who were with me then at the time, did a lot of work with the Professional Institute of Public Service. And I think through their efforts primarily, landscape architecture became recognized as a profession. And then back at the commission, we couldn't demand that a landscape architect, for instance, be a member of the CSLA. And but what we could demand, I found out, and we worked this out, that any landscape architect we hired, as with the other professions, but the landscape architects that we hired, had to qualify for membership in the CSLA. And I was determined that we were only going to hire landscape architects with degrees in landscape architecture and preferably master's degrees in landscape architecture. We, over the years, I was able to get student positions in the summertime. And I thought this would be an opportunity to hire students of landscape architecture. At the time, we had a school at, Guelph and Toronto and Montreal and so on. And we were able to hire students, and the student wages, salaries or wages for summer job, wages were quite good compared with other similar jobs in the country. So that, gave us a lot of satisfaction to be able to do that. And later on, I'll give you a list from my weak memory of the landscape architects who worked with me in my division, including Roman and Ed and Alowitz and on and on. And the projects we had to undertake were, I think, interesting, challenging, and oftentimes frustrating. I found it difficult when I first went with the government. I guess all the time I was with the public service. The number of meetings at that I had to attend at my level. And I used to get terribly frustrated when the major decision at the meeting was when we'd have the next meeting. And I thought this was really not the best way to run a railroad.
No. And coming from private practice,
yes,
you have a different kind of background.
Yes, and now just to expand a little bit on the National Capital Commission and the Design Division, we retained consultants, and my feeling was that we retained consultants in all the disciplines within the division, and we had consultants retained on contract from Quebec City, Montreal, Ottawa, and Toronto. And there wasn't much west of Toronto at that time. There was some, but we ran into things like travel expense. And that was a very debatable thing, really. But we did employ a number of LA offices from those locations. And that, I felt quite good about that. We were able to do that. That plus hiring students and have a good core of LAs on the staff. And,
it did a lot for the profession.
Pardon?
It did a lot for the profession.
I think it did. I think we to have it recognized within the federal service to that extent, and I was very disappointed, I suppose would be the word, that I couldn't, when I was with National Parks, I couldn't get an LA located in each region, in the regional office, with a design corps headquarters. And I don't know what they're doing now, but this sort of thing. But it takes a hell of a lot of missionary work to do this. So that, I've been blessed with good staff and good opportunities. And certainly in my career, the steps I've taken through my career, I have no regrets at all. I met some very wonderful people and been involved with some very fascinating projects.
What were some of, during you were with the National Capital Commission, for about 20 years. Is that correct?
Yes, that was a good part of my career.
1966 to 85.
Yeah.
What were some of the major projects that you undertook during that time that were significant to you? What are some that gave you special satisfaction?
Well, I think there is a variety of things that gave me some degree of satisfaction. The things that I mentioned about staff and consultants and that sort of thing, but we did work in Gatineau Park. The Ottawa River Parkway, which is sometimes called the Western Parkway. That was under construction when I came to Ottawa, and there's something here I should mention. Ned would ask me one day if I would quote, and it was possible to drive up on the roughly graded part of the parkway and have a look at it and come back and tell him what I thought of it. And I went up and I looked at it, and it was two separated carriageways, as the term was, and we would, as I drove up this area, the basic grading was done, and I came back and I said there was one curve, vertical curve out there that seems to me high, and if it were lowered, and this was possible, because we had grade separation between the up and down bound lanes, and this, I said, if it could be lowered, it seemed to me about 2 feet, that as you went around the horizontal curve and over this vertical curve, you could see Deschênes Rapids in the distance, and they're a big rapid river. So I think he went out and looked at it and took the chief engineer, his counterpart, with him, and Ned was a man of few words, really, and came back and said he thought that was probably valid. And I went back in a day or two, and the grading equipment was lowering the grade on this curve. And at that point, I guess I realized that Edward I. Wood, as Chief Landscape Architect for the National Capital Commission, was treated with a lot of respect. And anyway, this grade was lowered, and it did improve it. But it was a thought I had. He looked at it, agreed, and bang, it happened. And there are other aspects of the Ottawa River Parkway that were interesting. We initiated the bike path system in the federal lands, and that now ties into some of the municipalities when they capped from the P and so on. And I think that was a very worthwhile kind of use to bring into those open spaces. The airport parkway was built when I was director, and that was interesting. We had difficult soil problems and so on, and there were little tidbits along with that one that were challenges. We dealt with the official residences, 24 Sussex, Government House, Stornoway, and the Speaker's residence, which was one of the Mackenzie King residences in Gatineau Park. And I had occasion to meet most of these people. And the Governor Generals, for instance, that I had dealings with, I fairly often had coffee or tea with them to discuss certain aspects of the site problems there. I found them all to be very human people, and all quite different. The Mitchners, the LeGeyts, Shriners, and those people, and it was another aspect of the job. When the National Arts Center was built, and the old Union Station became Part of the trackage area became Colonel By Drive, and the old Union Station became the new Government Conference Center. We did a lot in that area, and I was standing with the Chief of Canals, Department of Transport at the time, who were responsible for the Rideau Waterway, on Cypress Bridge, and looking down toward the old station. The Arts Center was spanking new, and the old wall on the canal across by the old station was decrepit and cracked, and chunks missing, and all that sort of thing. And I said, there's something we have to do here, because I said, this is a use area. We ended up joining forces with budget, which made the Treasury Board happier than pigs. And we designed a pedestrian system by the canal and a place for visiting boaters to tie up. And I thought we did a very nice job. But one of the things in a lot of the projects we did of that sort, there was a plan in the distance, or kicking around at the time, called the parking plan, which would have done away with the east side of the canal as we knew it then, and even the conference side of the old station would be gone. But it seemed to be a long way down the track, as it were. So any project that was done on federally owned lands in the National Capital Region had to come before the National Capital Commission Advisory Committee on Design, which was made up of architects and landscape architects across Canada. When we went with the plan for the canal and pedestrian system by the conference center, Hart Massey, the architect, was a member of the committee. And I said, this can only be looked upon as with the parking plan in the off again, and we don't know when. This could only be looked upon as an interim solution. And Hart Massey, I thought, paid us a backhanded compliment. He said, well, it might be an interim solution, Don, but he said, when you people do an interim solution, it's so well done that we hate to see it destroyed later on, you see. And but anyway, that interim solution is still there. And the parking plan never went ahead. The Rideau Center thing happened, and so on. These interim solutions or long-range projects, that Bridget the Shane, for instance, was being talked about as imminent when I came to Ottawa. It's still not there. Another project that we were involved with was the Portage Bridge, which was a new bridge across Ottawa to Hull. So there are a great many projects that sort of happened and came about, and we were either directly or indirectly involved. As director of design, I had dealings on behalf of the commission with other levels of government. The provincial, we had 2 provinces to deal with, regional municipalities, and cities, Ottawa, and Nepean, Hull, etc. So I wasn't really near the drawing board, which was likely fortunate, and but I was doing other things.
You were doing the directing.
And I had good people doing the design.
And that's important, isn't it? I think if we, yeah. Maybe just to sum up a little bit and move on to a different area. I wonder if I could ask you, Mr. Pettit, how you feel that the nature of the profession of landscape architecture has changed in Canada, or maybe it hasn't, from the time that when you graduated from Harvard and you were working in Toronto, and then you work with the National Parks and the National Capital Commission, and you work across Canada. Do you have any sense that the profession has changed from that time until now in the 1990s?
I believe throughout my career the profession has changed in a very significant way insofar as public awareness is concerned. Certainly when I started out and when my predecessors started out, the original members of CSLA, all CSLA had at that time were federal letters patent. When registration through legislation came into being in Ontario, that was a milestone in the changing process of the profession in Canada, and hopefully someday we'll see that sort of legislation applicable from coast to coast, or I should say from coast to coast to coast. That's one way that it's changed. I think looking back to the scale of projects that some of the original members were involved with, the scale has changed over the years, and I would think many more larger scale projects being undertaken by landscape architectural offices, and of quite a wide variety.
There are more larger scale projects today, or there were in the past?
No, I think that there are perhaps, if we followed a graph line, if we had to do that kind of thing, we find that the graph would go from rather smaller scale things, and it would go up and it would peak, and then it might drop off a bit, but I think it goes up again, and hopefully will keep continuing to involve large chunks of our environment, whether it be a whole national park or a whole approach by a province to problems dealing with the environment. And I think that as the schools evolve and develop, and the students coming out of them, that they will find greater opportunities in these kinds of things, and but they're going to have to fight for it. And the future of the profession, if the CSLA could survive the 1930s with a small group of people in the worst financial times I think this country has ever had, and hopefully ever will have, if the CSLA membership could survive that, surely the future should be bright. Right now, our economic conditions go up and down, but the future should be bright, and I think we have to look to the future with a lot of optimism, because I think the profession is capable of dealing with a lot of the problems our environment and our society is going to face in the future.
What might some of those problems be? Do you have any sense of that?
Well, certainly population will be a big one, and the use of the environment by an expanding population, and that might be basic to a great deal of it all.
Do you see the nature of the profession changing in terms of how they, the types of projects that might be done by landscape architects?
Offhand, I don't necessarily think the types of projects would change all that much. Being if those, I'm speaking of those done by landscape architects per se. I think that landscape architects can and should and will become involved in multidisciplinary approaches to the solutions of some of our major problems that we're going to encounter in the future. And I think their training has to introduce them to that. It has to make them cognizant of other professions and be able to speak to them in a vocabulary that they both understand. I recall Don Mills, Ted Smith, who later became a partner in project planning. We were talking one time, and he said one time Mac was talking to me about horizontal and vertical curvature, roads and this sort of thing. And he said, I thought to myself, what in the hell does this petunia planter know about vertical and horizontal alignment of roads? And then he said, as time went on, he said, I began to realize that you guys knew quite a lot about that. And he said, as a matter of fact, you could even do something. And so, I think the multidisciplinary approach is going to be absolutely essential. And I think it's important, too, that if a landscape architect is going to be the prime consultant on a project, that he or she must know when to bring in other professions and what other professions are needed. And I don't think they're all necessarily physical development professions as such. That there are certainly sociologists and anthropologists and all of these, depending upon the type of project that's involved. But knowing when to bring them in and how to meld them into a team aiming toward a solution, right? That's going to be very, very essential.
Thank you very much for taking time to talk with me today. I have really enjoyed having a chance to explore some of these issues and ideas with you. Thank you.